So pleased to introduce Emma Kowal, who is Professor of Anthropology and Deputy Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of anthropology, science and technology studies and Indigenous studies. She's an author of several books, which hopefully she'll put up at the end, or they're also on our little program. Thank you, Ethel.
New identifiers, it's a very hot topic, and in some of the discussions that have been already this morning, the related issues have come up, and I will move fairly quickly to get through and have some time for discussion. So this is just an outline of what I'm going to talk about. And I'll start with false identification, just because this is the issue that takes up the most space. Oh, also, can we not put social media commentary on this particular talk? It's the first time I've given it, and I'm really just trying to get my ideas together about this. So any feedback, just please give it to me. But if that's okay with people. But I know the talk will be available on the website, and that's fine. And this is a very sensitive topic, and I have thought about it for a long time, and I hope that we can, have some good discussions today. So I'm starting with false identification just because I want to get it out of the way, because I don't think it's actually the most important issue, but it definitely gets the most oxygen. So Lauren O'Dwyer is a recent example. Who hasn't heard of Lauren O'Dwyer? Okay, yeah. So she was the Victorian candidate for Richmond in the last state election, which was just last year, wasn't it? Or maybe it used to be before now. We're losing track of the years. So she was standing for Richmond, and part of her whole shtick was that she's a Yorta woman. She had an identified position in a senior, in an arts organisation in Melbourne. After the launch of the campaign, Yorta people were saying, we don't know who she is, or actually we do know who she is, and her family's not Indigenous. And this became an issue in the media. So I'll just quote a little bit from her as quoted in The Age. She said, "I know who I am and I'm proud of who I am," O'Dwyer told The Age. "I've never represented or overrepresented my heritage. I'll always be learning. And there are many First Indo-Aboriginal people in this country that will, for the rest of their lives, be learning more and more about their identities. I'm just disappointed that my mum has to witness this being her being questioned about her identity." She holds a confirmation of Aboriginality from the Munda Aboriginal Corporation, seen by The Age, which is signed by particular elders. Among the criticisms on social media are that the local communities don't know her. She says she moved to Melbourne 20 years ago and her family connections to community were disrupted several generations ago. So members of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria had joined the calls for O'Dwyer to demonstrate her links to the Yorta community. They say, "Our identity is being watered down by people who are falsely claiming Aboriginal status. We see so many people claiming to be one of us without any experience or understanding of what it truly means to be Yorta. This is really impact on Aboriginal people and our daily lives. It's clear that a lot of people who are claiming Aboriginal status did not before, which raises concerns in our communities about why people are doing this and what it means for our communities." O'Dwyer says, "These attacks are hurtful and uninformed, and make no mistake, they're political in nature. Aboriginal identity is complex. I came to know my identity late in life because my family didn't speak of it. It was a secret held too long, and I mourn for what my family missed out on. I look to Aboriginal people strong in their culture and identity with longing and hope that my family can get there one day." So this was just one recent example, but it has a lot of features of what we've seen, across the country with increases in identification, and in some cases questioning people's identification. But if you think it comes up a lot in Australia, it comes up so much more in the US or Canada, and I just want to do a little bit of that comparison. So this is a New York Times article about Andrea Smith, who was probably the most famous identity fraud person. She's a very prominent Indigenous studies scholar and has, I think it was just last year before she resigned finally. And there's so much written about her, and that she said she was Cherokee for many, many years, but never had any evidence of it. And this was, known in the Indigenous community, but eventually called out. And in Canada, there's this. People are interested. Daryl Leroux is a Canadian scholar who has Indigenous ancestry but doesn't identify as Indigenous. But he's written this book, Distorted Descent: White Claims to Indigenous Identity, about groups in Quebec who have over decades came to the Indigenous groups, which he thinks are not Indigenous groups at all. It goes to the history. And in Canada, in the US, there's a lot of Indigenous scholars that have really been very concerned about that, particularly in Canada. So this is this list of what they're called pretendians, that kind of emerging term. And there's like these ideas about how people present their stories that may indicate that they are making it up. So I just want to contrast this, which is quite, it's pretty mainstream amongst Indigenous studies in the US and Canada. Very prominent scholars that are talking about this. I think in Australia, it kind of tends to be more on the seen as a right-wing thing to do. So this is Dark Emu Exposed, which probably most people have seen, which is like semi-anonymous and very much targeting particular Indigenous scholars or scholars who say that they're Indigenous and questioning their identity. It's seen as something that is malicious and is something that right-wing people do. That article there it's covered by The Australian, which is, I think it would be covered by The Age. So Vicky Groove-Williams and Susan Ingram are two Indigenous scholars who have spoken out about this and written about this, but they are not like central scholars like they're not like people like Kim Tallbear and who in the US who's much more central are talking about this. I think people, but the late Gaynor MacDonald was also working with Susan and Vicky on this. And I'll just quote from this article in The Australian, quoting Gaynor, that she estimates 5% of people counted as Indigenous Australian are actually white people self-identifying as Indigenous. She says they are well represented in the national Indigenous elite. Many gain high prestige jobs designed for Indigenous people, claiming insider knowledge they don't possess. Grassroots Aboriginal people resent having to deal with this, but feel unable to counter this tidal wave. The reason for this conversation is difficult for Australia. The reason this conversation is difficult for Australians is because in the past, discussion has singled out individuals. But this is a worldwide phenomenon, and it's time for a series of research initiatives because the harm is real. So in contrast to, I think, in Australia, where it's quite a nascent discussion, it's a very, very difficult discussion, and it tends to be co-opted by the right-wing media very, very quickly. In Canada and in the US, so Jessica Kolopanek is a very prominent Indigenous studies writer. In Tallbear, they are talking about this very openly. And in Canada, the universities and research institutes are taking this very, very seriously. And there's a whole lot of reports now and coming from Indigenous academics, but also the big funding agencies about how to deal with establishing indigeneity for people who have positions or are receiving funding. So it's very much more mainstream in those places. So just last year, there is now a National Indigenous Citizenship Forum run by the First Nations University of Canada, which is figuring out how to deal with identification across the whole country. So I'm not sure if that's where we might be heading, but that's definitely one possible place is to follow Canada with this. So now that's kind of all the context. I just want to talk about some data. It's important to understand that Indigeneity is something that changes over time for many people, Indigenous, identifying as Indigenous. So this is from Belinda Griffiths, who's a wonderful Indigenous epidemiologist. Her analysis she led, this is of the changes between the 2011 and the 2016 census, but similar changes have then happened in the most recent census. We just don't have this level of detail published yet about it. So this is the Indigenous population who identified as Indigenous in the census in 2011. There's about 548,000. So out of that group, a portion of them, about 40K, did not identify as Indigenous at the next census. So we call that the ADS, we're going to say demographers, but I'm not a demographer, but demographers call them no longer Indigenous. The people who have identified as Indigenous and still identify as Indigenous, they are consistently Indigenous. Then we have a group, we have people who have passed away. We have people who have then say they're not stated. They don't state in the 2016, which is a small group. We have Indigenous births who then, were not around in 2011, but now they're around. And we have this group of people who said that they were non-Indigenous in 2011 and now they're Indigenous. And that group was really quite large in 2016, 120,000. So the net increase in population was 80,000 from the net, what they now call non-demographic change. So change not from births and deaths, but from changing in identification. So that's the kind of change that we see. So there's really important caveats of this, what is called the standard Indigenous question, which is the question, are you of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin or both? It's self-identification. It's a question about origin. It doesn't say what do you identify as or who's your mob, or there's many things it could say. There's many reasons for people choosing not to identify or being filled out incorrectly despite their identification. And it is good data about how it changes across the life course for a whole variety of reasons. But now to talk about the most recent census, the number identified as being Indigenous in the most recent one, 2021, was 812,000. And it was an increase of 25%. So it's a big increase. The imputed population, because when they take into account the people that they didn't manage to get in the census, then they do an actual a better estimate from. So they reckon that there were just close to 1 million Aboriginal people in 2021. So 43% of the increase is due to demographic factors, but most of it is these non-demographic factors. And these previous non-demographic increases were quite a bit less. So now we're up to 92,000 non-demographic factors, and they were less in previous censuses. So the new identifiers in the most recent census, what we know about them so far is that the biggest increases for the census as a whole, of course, are in New South Wales and Queensland, which are the biggest, most populous groups, populous states of Aboriginal people, and then Victoria was next. The biggest proportional increases of Aboriginal population were ACT, which is up huge amounts, and Victoria and New South Wales. And in those places, in New South Wales, Victoria and Tassie, the non-demographic change accounted for over 60%. So we said overall non-demographic change, as in identification change, was about 56%, but in these places it was actually over 60%, and ACT in South Australia are just a little bit below 60%. So a big proportion of the changes in those eastern states are from identification change. Now, an important issue is that the biggest single, when we look at the different age groups, the biggest single age group that is changing is 5 to 9-year-olds. which looks like it is actually Indigenous births, which for some reason in the first census, when those kids are alive, they are not recorded as Indigenous. But then in the second census, when they're 5 to 9, they're catching up and they're being called Indigenous. They're identifying. So demographers, I don't really know exactly why that is. It's a really good question to ask, and probably a lot of Indigenous people would have some good ideas about why that might be. But yeah, a third of the new identifiers are made up, a third overall of that 5 to 14-year-olds. Now, this is a bit more of this is from the previous census, but as I said, there's been time to do kind of more analysis of new identifiers, and I think the trends here would be the same for the most recent census. So those who are new identifiers compared to what the ABS calls consistent identifiers are more likely to be higher socioeconomic positions. So they have higher income, higher employment, Year 12 attainment, post-school qualification likelihood. They live in major cities or inner regional, so only less than 4% of new identifiers were from remote areas. They predominantly live in New South Wales and Queensland, and as I said, 5 to 14 is a third, but then there's the rest of the group, so most of them. There's another big group from 30 to 65. So these are the adult new identifiers, which are some tens of thousands every census. Okay. So, and I suppose my point here is that the false identification gets a lot of news in the media. Andrew Bolt gets really excited. We need to write another blog. But I don't think that is really the story of these tens of thousands of people every census that are starting to identify. I think that's a distraction from this bigger story. So every time we have a census, there's all these newspaper articles about how, wow, the Indigenous population is way bigger than we expected. It's gone much bigger than the projections. Periodic census panic. These are just articles from last year, from the last census, but if you look at them, they happen every time. But the reason why that is, I don't think we're going to have that census panic anymore, because just now, the ABS has started to count new identifiers and put them in their projections. So, and this is again a really interesting question for the ABS, why they didn't do that before. So this is still the current projections. This is where they project what the Indigenous population is going to do in the future from 2019. There's something else that's going to come out later on this year. So in their projections, they called at this stage, they called it unexplained growth. Now call it non-demographic change. But their assumption is that there's zero unexplained growth. So when they're doing their projections, they are just using demographic factors, births and deaths, basically, and their assumptions are there is no unexplained growth. So it's shocking. I think that the ABS has just pretended that new identification doesn't exist, even though it's been quite significant, at least since the 90s. So that's an interesting question to wonder about. But now they are looking at it, and really this paper here from Andrew Taylor, a group led by Andrew Taylor, who's a demographer at Charles Darwin University, I think had a lot to do with it. So he and his team, this was published in 2021, and they actually looked at the Indigenous population as if new identifiers exist, which they do. So, and he predicted the 2021 census pretty much exactly. So, and it's really quite fascinating. So if you stop pretending that new identifiers don't exist, or if you stop pretending that don't, I got that right. So the green is the ABS projections, and then the black is actually if you take into account new identifiers. And actually you can see that it's consistent with what has been happening for quite some time. And the ABS projections are just, look, even just visually, you can see that they were always going to be off. And this is a big table. I work, but this is just the kinds of things that you can do if you look at what's going to happen into the future with taking into account new identification. I just want to point out, so this is the percentage of people who are Indigenous in these areas. So this is their projections, which, as I said, were correct for the 2021 census. That by 2051, in anywhere outside Sydney in New South Wales, outside Perth in WA, outside Hobart in Tassie, the Indigenous population is going to be, up around 15% of the total population. So this starts to have, huge resource implications, but also electoral implications. It's starting to look like New Zealand in these regions of Australia in terms of the proportion of the Indigenous population. So, that's why I think more people should be talking about this and thinking about this. This is, I better just move through it, but this is just another one of the pictures from tables from that Andrew Taylor paper, which is just showing us that identification change and then the momentum as well from those identification change, from that non-demographic change, has a massive impact on a lot of parts of Australia. So what is this? Who are these people? That's a good question. I think we know. There needs to be research on it. I, with Elizabeth Watt, through a discovery project that was funded a few years ago now, started to think about these questions, and the context was looking at thinking about genetic ancestry testing and what would happen once there was genetic ancestry testing for Indigenous ancestry, which actually only just happened in a major way just at the start of the pandemic, when Ancestry DNA changed its algorithm to have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestry estimate for all of its customers, which at that time was 100,000 Australians. Probably now, after the pandemic, it's more like 200,000, I expect. Anyway, before all that happened, I did some work with Lizzie Watt, and also Carmen Cummings came on as that's what I've talked about actually at the last meeting back in whenever it was, before the pandemic. And we were looking at a whole range of issues about who these people are, and we did do interviews with new identifiers, but also people who knew they had Aboriginal ancestry but chose not to identify, which is a group that no one had ever done research with before. So I won't try and summarise everything, but we do have also did a few pieces in the conversation that just really looking at this question of DNA testing. So in a nutshell, the paper we did in 2019 about new identifiers, we talked about how new identification is a mixture of different factors. There's a increased expression of individual chosen identity. So the whole idea of like identity finding is more pervasive in our culture these days. That Indigenous, the idea of being Indigenous, and the spirituality and culture that goes with that is seen as a very attractive thing, particularly for people who are otherwise think themselves as white or as having no culture. There is a much more of anticipation now that will be socially accepted when somebody starts to identify as an Indigenous. There are, I think people who are new identifiers are very much aware, and Francesca was just talking about at the end of her talk about the intra-community debates about whether you are Indigenous if you weren't brought up in community, versus these ideas about the hidden generations. So along with the stolen generations, you now have increasing talk about hidden generations, which is there was no stealing, but families were denying that they were Indigenous for generations. And now the young people are like, well, we want to reclaim these hidden generations, versus these kind of spiritual ideas about I always knew that I was Indigenous, and now I can kind of reclaim this feeling that I already always had. So I think that's kind of some of the social factors. But then there's also increased tools that we have much more digitisation of records and access and link up and all those services, but also providing people with lists of databases that they should be looking at. Social media, Facebook groups are incredibly helpful for people who are trying to discover Indigenous ancestry and, as I mentioned, genetic ancestry testing. This is just the announcement back in March 2020 that Ancestry DNA is providing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestry estimate. And there are a lot of Facebook groups. This is just two kind of examples of really common things that people post. So, hi there all. New to this and no idea. Trying to find the family mysteries. Wonder Room of being Aboriginal. And another one, I've had my ancestry DNA done and I have 3% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in my mix. How could I go about finding if there is a connection there somewhere? It says Parent 2 has the link. If anyone could help, that would be wonderful. So these are like peer-to-peer groups. That some people involved in them are very, very good at genealogy. There's groups where people are getting their data from direct-to-consumer services and uploading it into GEDmatch, which is where they upload all of their sequence data and that can be added to a group, a large group, to compare it like to kind of form a big family tree of all these people who are joining particular Facebook groups. And then they are reporting and discussing matches, which are very small matches and almost certainly, or maybe the vast majority of the time, are from shared European ancestry that they have, because this is mostly people from New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania. So that's interesting, but probably a bunch of them would be identifying in the census. We don't know. Ancestry DNA are interested in doing a survey of their customers to try and understand it through that direction as well. So there is really some interesting Aboriginal research. I don't know how many people here know Bindi Bennett, who's an Aboriginal researcher at, I think she's now at Central Queensland University or Southern Cross. So she did her PhD at ACU on developing identity as a light-skinned Aboriginal person with little or no community kinship ties. She's Wiradjuri, and she really described really well this journey of becoming Indigenous for people who discover some evidence or believe they have evidence of indigeneity. And it's things like working, volunteering at their local Aboriginal organisations, attending events, and even she's in talks, she's talked about purchasing property in your traditional area. So all of these interesting things, which is now kind of emerging as a social experience, a cultural experience of how to become Indigenous. So just very briefly to finish, 5 minutes. Well, I'll be less than that. So let's think about the policy implications. What I've presented here is just like little snippets of trying to understand new identification. It's obviously a very diverse group, and it'd be great to have some more research on who these people are and what their different stories are. But just thinking about this big demographic change that is happening, which demographers have said to me, it's the biggest demographic change that we have seen, since 1967 referendum. So, but it is very hard to talk about, particularly because it does get so adopted by the right. But there are lots of implications. So people have talked about how, because new identifiers generally have better health, better social, have a better social economic position than consistent identifiers, that just creates the appearance of closing the gap over time, potentially without actually any improvement in consistent identifiers. And also just geographically, it's shifting the Indigenous population towards the eastern states, further, making the Northern Territory, for example, a smaller and smaller proportion of the Indigenous population over time. There will be an increase in actual or perceived identity fraud. I'm sure that's going to happen, and I think that there's a lot that we can do as a society to try and make it not as toxic as it is in the US and Canada, maybe to get ahead of the curve and start to think about policy for how people should be identified, and doing that now before it gets really ugly. Of course, there's always issues with people who are already in positions, and people might question whether they should be there or not, but that's super, super complex. But we should at least be getting quickly policy into organisations, universities, so that prospectively there is a process that can, reduce the harm to everyone from false identification. Because people who turn out to have been false identifiers, maybe they didn't realise, but they're also going to be quite harmed from it. There is an increase in litigating in Indigenous identity in the courts, and I've had some really good chats here with Tim Dalp about information on this in relation to adoption, and I wonder if this mention of adoption in South Australia right before might also be related to that. So there are specific areas of law, and law is not at all my area of expertise, but for example, the migration cases recently where New Zealand citizens who were being deported were saying, well, we're actually Indigenous, even though we're not Australian citizens, and so you can't deport us. So also in adoption cases to figure out whether kids are Indigenous or not, and whether how the law should apply to them, where the parents might say, oh yeah, I think we're Indigenous, but I'm not sure. Then the court has to figure out, well, are they Indigenous or not, or are they plausibly Indigenous? So there'll be more and more areas of law where this question of whether people are Indigenous or not will be contested. Obviously, it has issues for native title rep bodies. You guys know about that. And yeah, I think it would be really good to offer resources to Indigenous organisations to have confirmation of Aboriginality processes that are sound. So I was then going to talk about what's the cultural meaning of this phenomena of what Indigenous whiteness you might say. I suppose I won't because I've run out of time, but there are some, so this is from my new book here. It's just come out, and there is a chapter there, which is very relevant to this, and probably these other two publications as well, where I've kind of started to think about what this means culturally. And just lastly, I wanted to point you to Francesca's wonderful paper that's quite recent, that's also looking at these issues, that's in How. So I will leave it there.